and rounded Fastnet Rock about a day and a half earlier than, or a day and a half later, ahead of the whole fleet, and we were on our way back to the finish line in Plymouth when we got a radio forecast. The radio forecast on the British Weather Service said that we would have winds of force 8 to 9, force 10 to 11 locally, meaning hurricane strength winds were coming in, and boy did it come in a vengeance. I'll never forget 35-foot waves breaking over our boat, seeing a red light, then a green light, and not sure which way to go to avoid an imminent collision with another boat. And that race was a total disaster. Of the 303 boats that started, only 87 got to the finish line. Sadly, 15 lives were lost, 3 rescuers were lost, and 23 boats either sank or were abandoned. Disaster. But out of that Fastnet race, there were some groups formed in Great Britain and the United States to take a good, solid look at ocean racing. How do we make this sport safer? What should we do with safety equipment? Should we require people to have safety at sea seminars before going out? The answer was yes. What should people be wearing? Should the race committee abandon a race or delay a start if bad weather is coming? Anyway, as a direct result of that experience, ocean racing is a lot safer today. I did a film, you're all in the energy business, and 5 years ago I did a film on energy. It's not exactly my expertise, nor is it my profession, but I got impassioned about our need for clean energy, and it's on my website, jobsonsailing.com. I interviewed a lot of people you've heard of, like Ernie Moniz, for example, and Patrick Moore from Greenpeace, and Stuart Brand from the Whole Earth Catalog, and Dan Poneman, who was the Deputy Secretary of Energy at the time, and it was Jimmy Rogers was running Duke Energy. Anyway, it's fascinating for me to do this, and that is my statement on energy, that phase out coal, please be clean. Nuclear is an option that we should, but wind and solar is very important too, and of course gas is abundant now, and that's a lot cleaner than coal. So I refer you to that. Going to sea, being out there on the ocean is one of the highlights in life. Why? Well, you get to enjoy it with their friends that share the same passion. The freedom to get away from land is special. You connect the generations. It's environmentally clean. Going out in the ocean is great. It's even better when you get to race another boat. So even if I'm day sailing or cruising, if there's another boat, I want to make sure that our boat is going just a little bit faster than the boat is alongside. But when you're at sea, the weather is variable and you can't control what's coming. You can know what's coming, but you can't control what's going to happen. And storms do happen when you're out there in the sea. How do you react to them? How do you mitigate that risk that we want to talk about? Well, you certainly have to rely on the integrity of the vessel and the equipment. And you've got to have total reliance on your shipmates and crew. You have to work together as a team, and the way to do that is to have good, solid leadership, which I'm going to talk about. And you've got to be able to learn how to make decisions when times aren't so smooth. It's easy to make a decision sitting at your desk, got plenty of time, and you can think it out. But like that moment in that Block Island race where I had to decide instantly, how do you react when either there's duress or there's some fatigue going on? It's something that we all have to train ourselves to do. So when do you take chances? Because if you become too cautious, too conservative, too careful, you'll never make progress with anything. For example, you might remember that experimental aircraft, the X-15. You know why they call it the X-15? The first 14 didn't work. The 15th one, they got it breaking the sound baiter. So there is lessons to be learned from failures and when making a mistake. And in my time at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy as a coach, and later over at the U.S. Naval Academy as a coach, I learned that making mistakes is okay because there's benefits that you learn things when things don't go as well as you want. I find that experience is a very helpful guide, And one of the things I like to do is taking chances, is to look what people are doing in other businesses and industries. So you're all involved in offshore energy, whether a regulator or a company, but you're always trying to make advances. And sometimes advances are very incremental. But a good way to shortcut things is to look, what are other people doing? Are there any analogous situations? Ted Turner, for example, is frustrated as a young guy with his fledgling TV network, and he reads about Western Union, how they're sending signals and their message is up into the sky, into a satellite. Gee, he thinks, I wonder how I could do that with TV. Well, he goes and figures out how they're doing it. Then he hired some of those people, and then he got going and was one of the ones to start getting national TV. And at the time, Ted kept telling me, buy stock. I'm so glad I did at that time. It made life a little bit easier. So my message there is, by looking at other academia, other industries, other cultures, in my case, other sports, you can learn things that can help you out. Here's an example. So I sailed in 5 America's Cups. I'm glad to be on a winning boat 2 times, but I've also been a losing boat 3 times. So I know the difference between winning that big regatta and losing it. And in 1987, this fledgling network that nobody had really heard of called ESPN got the rights to cover the America's Cup, and I was invited to try out as an announcer. So I sat around a room with these people asking me sailing questions, which I could answer, and I got the job. But how do you cover sailing? So I went back and I looked at some old films on the America's Cup to see what it looked like when people covered. And I have to report, I've never seen a more boring television/film than little triangular boats off in a distance, separated by a couple minutes. What am I going to do? And I know what it's like to race a cup boat. It might look beautiful from a distance or slow from a distance, but on board it's a war. And you've got to be coordinated with a crew and very athletic and strategic. So how do we do that? So using Ted Turner's lesson, the answer was, how could we put onboard cameras on these boats and wire up the skippers and the tacticians so we could listen to what they're saying? Things can get heated out there in the water. So anyway, we use this technology, put it together. It had never been done before. And unlike a football game where everything's plugged into a wall to cover what goes on in that field, when boats are racing, there's no wires or plugs to put on a sailboat. You've got to get that signal, the picture, and the sound back ashore. We were able to do it. Because we pulled that off, the sport of car racing took our technology and did it. Huge success on ESPN. In fact, the NFL decided that it was so successful, maybe ESPN was qualified to do football. So I feel really good about that. The next America's Cup came around, and the question was not seeing what was going on board, but understand, why did one boat go in this direction and the other boat go in this direction, and who's ahead and who's behind. In a football game, you know the score. In a sailboat race, you don't. So the answer was to use GPS technology so you can locate precisely where the boat is and make some really cool graphics. So we did that for the next 2 America's Cups, and our team that put this together, and they're all sailors, by the way, we could do this for other sports. And the next thing they did is they came up with a colored hockey puck that you could follow, and it was a total disaster. People did not want to see a red hockey puck. So the next endeavor with our America's Cup crew was, maybe we could tell you in a football game where the 1st and 10 line is. And anyway, they created that. It was a huge success. The America's Cup in San Francisco in 2013, they were able to take it to a new level. I was so proud to be part of that team, the non-technical part of it. But anyway, it tells you that one sport, the information and technology is transferable to another sports. And if you saw the Olympic Games where a skier would go down the slope and then another skier, and then they would overmatch them, that came out of our America's Cup technology team. Very cool to be able to do that. So how do you reduce risk. Well, on a sailboat, you reduce risk by planning in advance, understanding the weather. Do you have the right equipment? Is the crew experienced? And you can bring in some new people that have not done a race before, new to ocean racing, as long as the majority of the crew is experienced. Set a goal. A mission statement, whatever you do, is absolutely essential in life. Our goal is to. The mission of our project is to. By doing some short words, everybody knows what they're doing. Seek advice. I learned from Ted Turner a long time ago as a young guy. He's one of these people that's always asking questions all the time. But when you ask questions, listen carefully, because people might answer it, but they already know the answer. So, oh yeah, you just want to blah, blah, blah. But often there's some really good advice in those answers. And then pay attention to details when you're trying to minimize risk. And what I like to do is I make incessant lists when I'm doing any project or going on an ocean race of things that we need to do, what do we need to achieve. So it's like a pilot with a checklist on the plane. They religiously go through that every time they take off. So how do you get this done? Well, I think one of the sad things about our society today is the art of good communication is getting lost. Yes, it's a lot easier with social media and internet and email and texting and all this stuff. My daughters do a lot better than me. But the communication of directly talking to people is something that's so essential in our life. And I wish colleges would make public speaking a required course, because you need to sell your message. So here's some thoughts on clear communications when you're getting a endeavor going. So I take this from my sailing. Big race coming up this week. I have a crew of 15 people on a 70-foot boat, a highly motivated, very wealthy owner that wants to win, kind of like an NFL. These people don't understand defeat, and we want to do well. So the first thing is have a group meeting. That's mandatory. Everybody has to attend this meeting. And explain the goals, the mission statement, and encourage input. The next is, as a leader, very important to avoid arrogance, which some of us, sometimes I can fall into, and you just try to work out of that. And like I said, welcoming questions is important, so everybody feels they have input. And then I like to forecast things that might happen in advance. So while we're out there, these are some of the problems we might face along the way, and here's how we're going to address them. So that if one of those unfortunate events happens, somebody falls overboard, we rip a sail, everybody's mentally prepared and not panicked when something goes wrong. And then I think most importantly, when you have your crew meeting, your team meeting, no secrets. There's nothing worse that destroys morale more than when secrets are being told. Everybody's got to be on it. So how do you mold opinions? Again, this is part of reducing risk. Always be accurate with whatever you say. Be enthusiastic. I try to be enthusiastic. Be available all the time to people on your team. Be helpful when you don't need to be. Know how to reach people. And use third-party endorsements. There's a great story I read about, and I'll tell you who the author was. You'll know his name for sure. But I was reading this book a few years ago, and it was about 5 cadets at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point. And they made a pact with each other that after they graduated, that no matter where they were going to be the rest of their lives, the rest of the careers in the Army or beyond the Army, they would speak really well of each other and promote each other. So what about that? Oh, he's one of the greatest managers ever. He was a great military officer. And by promoting each other, it lifted all their games. One ran General Motors, one became President of the United States, President Eisenhower. Anyway, it was a great story about you can help people a lot by promoting each other, which is one of the strongest messages that I like to tell people. If you want to get ahead in life, do this one thing. You ready? Say nice things about people. When you say something nice or send a nice message on the email, it will come back around in your favor. People are so appreciative when they get good feedback from something like that. Making decisions. On the one hand, being a leader is nerve-wracking. Some people avoid it at all costs. But on the other hand, isn't being a leader the essence of life? When you get to be part of a group and at the end of the day, make a decision. When you're a leader, when you're making a decision, be decisive. I often find, go with your first instinct. Remember taking a test in school and, oh yeah, the answer is B. Well, maybe not. Just go with your first instinct. You're usually a little bit better off. Avoid having the all-hands situation. On a ship, if there's an all-hands situation, you got to take it seriously. But if you have one every 6 hours, people don't pay attention. So if there's a problem, don't do that often. Don't tolerate second guessing. I was in this race 2 summers ago, and it was a complicated course. We were racing up in Maine. Complicated because you go to the west shore, the east shore, or up the middle, and the currents are pretty strong with the big tide in Maine. And anyway, we had a pretty tight regatta, and there was this young man on the boat that about halfway up the first leg would say, now why in the world do we go this way? Didn't you know there was more wind to the right? Well, I guess there is more wind to the right. This happened 3 days in a row. So at the morning crew meeting, I got the young 25-year-old back, and I said, you've had a lot of suggestions on what we've been doing wrong. So here's your opportunity today, before the race starts. Which way should we go? We could go to the east shore, we could go to the west shore, we could go up the middle. What would you suggest? Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Well, then I would suggest don't tell us in the middle of the race, why didn't you do that? It reminds me of those danger expressions. You know what the danger expressions are? When people say things like, no worries, I start worrying. Or better yet, well, that's not my responsibility. Or even worse, I told you so. I hate hearing those kind of things. Anyway, you get the message about being a leader. Now, I brought some pictures along of sailing. This is a little 2-minute clip that I'd like to show you. And what I did, I put this together that sailing is a sport for life. Unlike some sports where you're washed up at the age of 28 or so, sailing's a sport I'm learning that you can do forever. So anyway, here's a little look at sailing for life. And I hope it inspires you to be on the water. There's some music here. It's good, but music makes it better. Turn it up on the computer. Okay. Anyway, a universal sport with all kinds of elements to it. Big classic yachts, one designs, athletic Olympic classes, boats always in close quarters, tight situations, very diverse. Home for disabled sailing, kids enjoy it. So as you can see, it's not like watching grass grow, as President Eisenhower once suggested when he watched the America's Cup in 1958. Look at that. Can you figure out who's ahead there? Cape Horn, I've been around that 3 times. Disabled sailing doesn't hold anybody back from being on the water. And sailing can be spectacular, sometimes too spectacular. This is me, by the way. No, I'm kidding. I told my daughters, yeah, I was out kiteboarding. They didn't believe me. And of course, when you win something, it makes it all worth it. So anyway, that's my little piece, sailing, a sport for life. Thank you. Okay, so how do you develop a team? Like I said, explain the goal and the missions. And when you bring a team together, you have very diverse talents. And what I like to do is blend people together so we all understand. In sailing, you have the designers and the architects and the sailors. It's kind of like getting the scientist and the artist to work together on the same team, same page. And one of the most interesting sailing events that I've seen in a long time was 2 years during the America's Cup. The United States, in a series where you had to win 9 races, was down 8-1. Can you imagine being down 8-1 and you've got to be able to win 8 straight races against somebody that's already beat you 8 out of 9 times? How do you react? Well, that sailing team, the U.S. team, they did not panic and they had a team meeting. And they took the trophy, the America's Cup, and put it on the table so when they had the meeting, everybody was looking at the trophy they're trying to win. I thought that was a nice little touch. And instead of blaming each other or why they weren't winning, the mantra around the table was, how can I help? What can I do? So everybody was assigned, make a list of what we can do. So the designers made their list, the sailors made their list, the coaches made their list, the managers made their list, and they came together in an all-night session, and they came up with, what should we do? Well, technically, they needed to figure out how to do foils. These boats flew over the water on foils, how to get them accurate. So get the supercomputers over at Berkeley and some people that know how to do this on that case. And we're not sailing the boat properly. You know, you're losing football games. Eventually you change the quarterback. I don't know what we got to do with the Redskins, but anyway, that's a whole nother issue. But anyway, they changed some personnel, and they started sailing the boat differently. And then, most importantly, the skipper went out of his way to show confidence. So I'm sitting at this press conference in San Francisco, and the 2 skippers are coming up to explain where they are. The score is 8-1. 8-1. New Zealand, the challenger, needs to win one measly 40-minute, 10-mile race, and they have 8 chances to win. And the skipper for New Zealand, young man Dean Barker, comes and sits on a stool, arms folded across the chest, looking very confident. And their team had a chartered 777 at the tarmac at San Francisco Airport, ready to take the cup and the team back in their triumph to New Zealand. The American skipper comes in about a minute later, and he comes bouncing up onto the stage looking like Popeye who'd just eaten a can of spinach. And before anybody in the assembled press corps could say anything, and I'm sitting there in the 4th row, the U.S. skipper, down 8-1, says, I have good news. All of you here are going to get to write about the greatest comeback in the history of sports. We figured out how to go faster, and we're going to win, and you get to watch it. And I'm sitting there thinking, holy cow. I better hope he wins because, man, this guy's going to get killed. But he won 8 races in a row. But he did it not to be a grandstander, but to send a message not only to his team, but also to get New Zealand on their back foot. And what New Zealand did wrong here was they took the attitude, well, we're winning, things aren't broke, we've had a little bad luck here, but our turn will come, the brakes will go the other way, let's not change a thing. The worst thing you can do in any endeavor in life is not make improvements, not make changes. So when the U.S. boat figured out how to go 32 knots upwind, and the New Zealand boat could only go 24 knots upwind, New Zealand had no answer, and they were able to win the cup. So I thought that was quite an astounding turnaround. Okay, I'm going to tell a story, and after the story, maybe we have some time for some questions. We doing okay time-wise? I'm down to my last 3 hours now. Yeah. Got about 5 more minutes before questions. So I spoke at a leukemia fundraiser in San Francisco on this weekend, and I was so proud. They raised $667,000 at this event, and I got to interview on stage a guy named Joe LeCobb. Joe LeCobb owns the Golden State Warriors that won the NBA championship, and so I had to tie in boating and basketball. So this is the story I told with a little bit of message. So at the age of 20, in 1970, we had a big regatta coming up at New York Maritime. It was the Mid-Atlantic Championship. And the winner of this regatta was going to go to the National Championship in California. I'd never been on a jet plane before, and I certainly had never been to California. And I heard there were blondes and sports cars and the Beach Boy. I wanted to go to California. We had to win this regatta. The night before the regatta, the New York Knicks were playing Game 7 of the NBA Finals. So I wanted to go see that game, even though I had to race Saturday and Sunday. So I snuck out and I went down to Madison Square Garden in New York City. And I'd done this 3 or 4 times during the year. And at that era, there was a door at Madison Square Garden Arena, and the door would open up, and if you were in uniform, if you were a sailor or soldier in uniform, if there were some extra seats, they might let you sit in the nosebleed seats all the way up in the top of Madison Square Garden. So I show up. Scores 3-3. The New York Knicks against the LA Lakers, and the usher opens the door and says, "Gentlemen, I'm sorry, we're sold out tonight. There's no chance." But to me, he grabs my elbow as everybody turns away and says, "You wait here." Now, my father had suggested, when you do this, make sure you give the guy letting you in a nice tip. So I probably gave him $2 or $3, which in 1970 at the age of 20 was a fortune. It's like $50 now. But I always gave the guy a tip. Nobody did. He remembered me, the young kid that gave him the tip. "You wait here." 10 minutes later, the door opens up and he says, "Come with me." And he takes me not to the rafters, but behind the bench of the New York Knicks. And I'm sitting next to an actor, Dustin Hoffman. That was the game where the star center for the New York Knicks, Willis Reed, had been hurt. He'd missed 2 games, and he came limping out of the locker room, out onto court, and people went crazy, and the Knicks went on to win the game. Nice. So I was very inspired for the next day, and after the game, somehow Dustin Hoffman, who's about this tall, and I got swept up with the team in the melee, and we went running with the team into the locker room. I don't think you can pull this off today with security, but in 1970 we did, and I ended up in the locker room, and I got all the New York Knicks autographs, and I was there. Howard Cosell had been covering it for ABC, and I listened to the interviews of him interviewing Dave DeBuscher and Walt Frazier and Willis Reed. Very cool. And to this day, I have that sheet with all the autographs. The next day, Saturday and Sunday, we had the Mid-Atlantic Champs, and with all that inspiration, we went out, won the regatta, went to the Nationals, won the Nationals. Very inspiring. But let me go a little further. I'm not done yet. So many years later, 2003, and I've had a great life by now. I've sailed in 5 America's Cups. I'd cover 7 by that time on television. I've been to every Olympics since 1984, and my family was doing good. Things were great. But things turned for me. I, in 2003, covered the America's Cup in New Zealand, and instead of being the fastest guy running through the airport, I was totally fatigued. I had red blotches all over my skin. I had a horrible cough that wouldn't go away. I was losing weight like crazy. I had night sweats. And finally, after the Cup, I went on a lecture tour. 63 cities. City 23, Cleveland, Ohio. I literally crumpled up. So I came home and got tested and got diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now that was quite ironic for me because 10 years earlier, I'd been a volunteer helping raise money for leukemia, and now I have one of these blood cancers myself. And I can report it was tough. I went through rounds of chemo, I got well for about 2 weeks, and ended up doing a bone marrow transplant. I was in great shape for about 4 months, and then it came back again. I'm now in the hospital. I can no longer walk. I'm 80 pounds lighter than I am right now, and not feeling pretty good and very depressed. I'm calling the nurse, and the nurse shows up, and she sees how depressed, and she says, "Mr. Jobson, why don't we get some television? You work for ESPN, right? Let me find a station. And there on the station, on ESPN Classic, was an old basketball game. Can you guess which one? I'm going to get tears in my eyes now. Game 7 of the 1970 NBA Finals. There I am in a hospital bed watching the Knicks, still blowing out the LA Lakers in that wonderful game. And at the end of the show, there's Howard Cosell interviewing Dave DeBusschere and Willis Reed, and this kid with brown hair and pimples all over his face in a uniform is sitting there. There I was. Tears started running out of my eyes, and I remembered at that very moment the inspiration I got from that basketball game and team to go out and how I turned things around and won that Mid-Atlantic Championship to go on to the Nationals to win. And at that moment I thought, I did it then, I can do it now and get out of this situation. So you never know when things are going to go bad or south in your life, but when they do, and if they do, the inspiration from others or certain events helped me. So my sailing career helped me overcome that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and all that money that went to cancer research, and I'm still the volunteer chairman of the Leukemia Cup 23 years later. In the end, I ended up being the recipient of all that research to be with you today. Thank you. Okay, questions? Anybody have any questions? Yes, Brian.
Okay, Brian.
Well, thanks, Gary. That was really awesome. I did have a question for you, and it relates to the kinds of things that the oil and gas industry faces on a regular basis, and that's the rate of change in technology. Things change rather quickly offshore. It's a very innovative industry. The way things are done today are not the same as they were done necessarily 10 years ago, at least at the cutting edge. So I was looking at your video, and there's all different kinds of technologies that were represented there, everything from old gaff riggers to hydrofoils. As you live at the cutting edge of technology and sailing, you know, and hull shapes are always changing, keel designs, and now they're riding up on foils. How do you stay ahead of the technology, and how do you train your crew to deal with new technology, and particularly those that maybe bring in baggage from previous technologies? How do you cope with that?
Excellent question. So one of the problems that you have with new technology and advancements is, for sure, there's going to be somebody that's against it and doesn't want to risk any change. And then you have a traditionalist. I'm a traditionalist. I love what happened in the past, and I respect the past winners, and I marvel at the technological marvels of the day. But the real mission is, how do we go faster, and how do we do it safer? So you borrow technology from other industries. So the foiling technology comes in part from the aircraft industry. And then instead of building contraptions that might fail, you go into wind tunnels and computers and test things in advance. And of course, once you get somebody on one of those boats, and by the way, I was the only person to sail on both the New Zealand and America's Cup boats, and it was pretty exciting. I will admit, it's the first time in my entire career I didn't volunteer to steer. I didn't want to be responsible. So I think you need a strong leader, like a Ted Turner type, to say, well, I like what we're doing with our TV, but we're going to do news 24 hours a day. And the New York Times calling it the Chicken Noodle Network, but actually it worked out pretty good for Ted Turner. So vision, somebody to lead it, a team to make it happen, and I think we're learning from the Apples of the world and lots of corporation that change is good and you just want to keep outmoding what you've had in the past. By the way, this summer I went to a very cool place off Canada called Sable Island. It's about 200 miles southeast of Nova Scotia. Sable's a French word that means sand. Nobody's there. I noticed 3 oil rigs well off the island, and I'm sure that's quite a treacherous sea. And I thought, boy, in this pristine island with nobody around other than horses and seals. Somebody introduced horses there. There must be some good technology to keep those oil rigs out there. Any other questions? All right, well, let me just close with one last little bit here. So I like the English language. I like words, and I've written a lot, believe it or not, 19 books. You have my memoir book, but there's 18 other books, all trying to tell you how to sail better and faster. But the memoir book was quite a departure for me, and I had to hire an editor, because if you write about yourself, you never know when you're too braggy or too modest. And with an editor, Gary, too much of that. We don't want to hear that. Or we want to hear more about your family. So anyway, that helped me out with that. So here are my favorite words. 4 words that I really think are important. Excellence. I've learned over the years that I do best when I concentrate on fewer things than trying to do too much. But whatever you do, try the best you can. Just keep trying to do better and try and hit that word, excellence. The next word I learned from Ted Turner is loyalty. When you're loyal to people, they will be loyal back to you. That's why saying nice things about people really does come around. I love that word, loyal and loyalty, important. Next favorite word, integrity. The people that rule in life are those that do what they say they're going to do. They're good for their word, and they're honest. We live in a complicated world, and I find that people with integrity are the people to associate with. I'm on the board of something called the International Sailing Federation. So we're the regulator of the sport of sailing. So for those of you in the regulatory part of the business, I understand. You're not always the favorite because you got to come up and do the rules. But integrity really counts. And by the way, I know there's people here from about 20 countries. On our executive board, there's only 8. You have to get elected.